Hey guys, and welcome to another episode of the Barbell Lifestyle Podcast. I'm your host, Christina Lynn, and I'm here with my co-host, Marissa Roy. And in today's episode, we're going to be chatting a little bit about why your body might be fighting fat loss.
Yeah. And this is really for the person who maybe listens to a lot of our stuff and is like, dude, I get it. Basic habits, foundations, do the basics. But there are small percentages of people that are actually doing all these basic things and all of the foundations, and you're not seeing results. And so for you, this episode is going to dive a little bit deeper into kind of how do we get more granular when we need to get more granular and be able to dial in results more. So that's the big preface caveat covered here. If you are somebody who's not doing all the basics, which we'll just list out probably at the beginning to cover it, then you should probably go back to any other episode that we have on how to just build the healthy lifestyle foundations. But if you are, let's just say, eating your consistent caloric macronutrient intake, you are tracking that every single day, like you have proof and data that that's consistent, steps, sleep, what else? Water intake, fruits and vegetables, food quality, like all that's like pretty 80-90% all the time, and you're like, what gives? And you're not overeating on the weekends, you're not taking days off tracking, you're not doing anything off the rails, and you're self-aware enough to realize that, then what gives? Then this is for you.
Yeah, and then also one of the things that you didn't mention, but we have been talking about the previous episodes is stress. Like we definitely want to make sure that we're mitigating stress, we're not stressed, but then it's like, yeah, okay, it's like what gives? Because everything is quote unquote right. It looks right on paper. So I think the first thing that we want to talk about again is like really making sure we are dialing in the details. So Marissa and I, we were chatting about this the other day when we were coming up and thinking about topics. So we had a client who was in this position, and so everything is quote unquote right. So we dove in, we took a peek at like her macro log. We were looking at food quality. We were looking at some other things because it's like we want to think about kind of like that pyramid, right? So we want to start with those foundations. Foundations are awesome, cool. Let's move up and like continuing to move up the pyramid and kind of figure out like, okay, what can we do? Because if we're fine tuning and we're focusing on the 1% details, but the foundation isn't there, like it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter like what your sodium looks like, right? I mean, to an extent, if those foundations aren't there. So she knows she was hitting her macros, like she was doing all these things. So we took a peek at food quality. And so, yeah, she was hitting her macros. She was eating mostly whole nutritious food sources, but she was also kind of going to Chick-fil-A, or she'd grab some protein bars, or she'd do this. So we were like, hey, like because your goal is fat loss right now, we might need to dial it in a little bit more. And again, it's just kind of like this is just a temporary thing that we need to do to reach a goal. It's not something that we need to do all year round. This is just for this specific goal. So we were like, hey, like, yes, Chick-fil-A, eating out, doing, grabbing a protein bar, like, or a protein shake, those are totally fine. But for right now, since we're not seeing progress, like, let's make a few changes and see if anything happens. And the other thing that we did was we actually increased her food intake, and we bumped cardio down a little bit, and we saw progress. She like looked like she dropped weight overnight. So it might have been, a stress. She was stressing that her body wasn't seeing progress, or it could have just been the food choices. A lot of different things to consider. But that helped a ton. The other thing that we did was we took a peek at sugar. So I don't demonize sugar whatsoever, but looking at her food log, it was, I think, sometimes like 120 grams. Sometimes it was around 80. Sometimes it was around 80. So we were just like, hey, let's just keep it around like 50 to 60, like 70 max. And let's just see what that looks like. There's also a really big difference too between like added sugar and just like natural sugar that you'd find in like, fruits and things like that, or milk. But we did want to pay a little bit of attention to those things and saw some changes. And then the last thing that we did with this particular client was for like her average for sleep, she was averaging like 7 to 8 hours, which again looks great. But if you like peek and look in, maybe like one night a week, she'd get like 5 hours of sleep. And so that was a conversation like, hey, yes, overall sleep is fantastic, but let's really work on 7 to 8 hours every single night. So if that means that you have to like not meal prep, or like, because that I think that was sometimes her thing, or we have to take a step back in some other areas, like let's really focus on sleep quality. So all of those things, we started seeing some progress, like some really big progress. So it's like, it's hard because again, on paper, everything looked good. But when we kind of dove in and looked at the day-to-day things, that's where we were able to make some changes.
Yeah, so let's dive in because this is a great example of kind of what's really common when it comes to this case in particular. And let's dive into exactly why each of those tweaks worked. So we have basically with the nutrition, how accurate are we really being with our food entries? And
Yep.
then you also looked at a little bit more on food quality when it comes to sugar and processed food choices. And then we have kind of the recovery aspect of sleep and stress on the body. So I want to dive into the how accurate are we really being thing
Yeah.
first. And really, when it comes down to it, when you're tracking your food, you're tracking your macros, nothing is 100% accurate. Like even and I've used this example in the past, but it's been a while, so I'll refresh, right? Like even your USDA log of chicken breast that is, 100% verified. It's got the green check. It's, on the USDA website this is what chicken breast is. But what you don't know is when you have that chicken, there's hundreds of chickens in the coop. And are all of them getting the same amount of feed? Are all of them getting the same amount of exercise? Like how much muscle does a chicken have versus the next? The accuracy of maybe the protein density of the meat isn't going to be 100% accurate. Now, listen, it might be 99% accurate. And that's why we go for those single ingredient, non processed foods, because they're going to be much more accurate. But you just can never be 100% certain. And so when we go kind of up a level to packaged and labeled foods, things that come out of boxes, individual wrappers, bags, those sorts of things, they are rounded to the nearest kind of whole number on the label. And, the portion size might actually differ from what's in the package. So, a great example of this was back in my bodybuilding days, I was a protein bar fiend. And I also was an accuracy fiend when it came to tracking my macros. So there was a time in my life where I would take the protein bar out of the wrapper and then weigh the protein bar to see how close or different it actually was. And while, at that time in my life wasn't coming from the greatest place mentally, it's really good information that I now have in hindsight of like, it's definitely not even close sometimes. Like I would take a protein bar out, the label would say 63 grams is the serving size of the bar. And I put the thing on the food scale and it was like 75 grams. And I was like, oh, got it. So I'm going to plug it in as what it is rather than what the label says. And labels are allowed by the FDA to round by up to what, 20-25% or something crazy like that for what they actually package versus what's on the label and the serving size. So not only do we want to scan the label and measure the serving size, but we want to make sure that like it's actually true. And so there's parts that we can't control, like in manufacturing, if a food is actually has the nutrient density that it says it does. But what we can control is the portion size that we give ourselves or what we log in our app. And so that's where, again, preface at the beginning, this is not for everyone, but if you are dialing in, like those are things that could make a big difference. Or like breads, for example. Breads typically, if they're pre-sliced, they should be a certain number of grams per slice, but throw it on the food scale just to see once or twice. I guarantee you it's going to be different than what's on the label. So that can make a difference and really add up over time if you're trying to hit a certain number of calories, carbs, fat, protein, and you're not seeing progress. Think about how many things do you pull out of a box or bag, and how many things are you scanning a label for? And what does that add up to in terms of how many calories you might actually be overeating beyond your targets? So,
Yeah, I remember back in those days, the hardcore prep people, I'm pretty sure it was you, weighing their bread and adjusting their entries in MyFitnessPal to be as exact as possible. Now, prep is a whole different beast, but for the majority of time, like if you track the same piece of bread, like over and over and over, like let's say you have the same piece of bread every morning, eventually it's gonna like even out, right?
yeah.
Like one day it's gonna be smaller, one day it's gonna be bigger. Like so just be consistent. So this is not to freak you out and make you weigh your protein bars and pieces of bread and things like that. But it's just the idea that like if you if you are eating something out of a package for all of your meals versus you're like doing everything with like more whole nutritious foods, there's a big difference in variance in what you're like. Let's say you're eating 2000 calories. So if you're eating everything coming out of a package 2000 calories, it might be 1800, it might be 24, 25, 2600, just because of the area, the level of error, versus if you're like weighing and cooking and everything, the margin of error is going to be a lot smaller.
Yeah. Well, and with the food quality too, there's kind of two other things that play into it that I've
Yep.
gone into detail a lot recently too, is the actual quality of the food. Let's say when I say quality, I just mean like single ingredient versus processed or packaged. When it is a single ingredient food, produce, meat, dairy, those sorts of things, they are going to have a higher thermic effect to eating the food. So the thermic effect of food is essentially the principle that it actually takes burning calories to digest the food that you eat. So the more processed things that you eat, the less calories you actually burn in the process of digesting your food. Whereas if you eat a high protein, nutrient dense, single ingredient food dense diet, the thermic effect of food of those is much higher than of packaged and processed. So you're actually going to burn more calories just by swapping, say, your breads for your sweet potatoes, because not because the food is better or worse than the other, but because one food actually has a higher thermic effect than the other. And that can make, granular differences in your day to day. And the second thing that I think we probably haven't talked too much about, but when you use the bread example, it made me think of this, is variability in your diet. So, like you said, if you eat the same piece of bread over and over and over again, it evens out. But I think the issue is when people are, say, tracking macros, they have flexibility in their diet, they're almost abusing the flexibility to have something different every single day, new recipes all the time, and never really having consistency in what's going in. And if you are in a position where you're really trying to dial in the fat loss, I would say, like, try to keep the majority of your diet kind of like a self-made meal plan style, where your meals are on copy paste or repeat for the most part, right? Obviously, have your Friday night meal be a little bit different, or make dinner a little bit different here and there, or when you do go out on the weekends, allow yourself to be more flexible, but your kind of like base diet should be repeatable things. And what that does is it just eliminates the room for error in that caloric intake. So that way, you know that not only am I eating things that are pretty accurate to their entry in MyFitnessPal, but also I'm not changing it up to where there's a bunch of margin for error on the day to day either.
Yeah. And then the other thing I was thinking about too when you're talking is also when you're eating mostly whole, nutrient dense foods, single ingredient, you're going to have a very different, and sorry, my son's in the background. It's probably pretty loud. Um, but there's also like an inflammation response typically from eating packaged foods.
Yeah.
So that's a whole other like thing that I'm not 100% qualified to speak on as far as like all the gut issues and symptoms like that. But we typically do see an inflammation response. So for this client that I was talking about in particular, we cut those things out. And we did. It was like night and day difference. It looked like she had dropped
Mm.
like 5 pounds overnight. And a lot of it was that inflammation. So
Yeah.
that's another thing to think about.
Yeah. Well, and what I'll say that I do know enough about at this point would be when it comes to those inflammatory foods, whether that's just because they're highly processed or because you have a food sensitivity. A
Right.
lot of people have food sensitivities to gluten and dairy, and that doesn't mean that you can't have them, and it doesn't mean you shouldn't have them. But if like the majority of your diet is gluten and dairy heavy and you are sensitive, it's going to result in an inflammatory response where you generally are going to just hold more water weight and maybe feel puffier. And
Mhm.
just not eliminating, but reducing the amounts that you have of those things could drastically impact just the water weight that you carry. And if to you that allows your body, if that allows you to feel like you're making more progress, and when you have less inflammation, your body kind of has less of a stress response too. So it's probably going to respond better to fat loss as a result, then that might be a temporary shift to make, right? And just to understand the impact that those things can have on your body. I'm not saying that's everyone, but if you notice that you play around with it, you remove gluten and dairy for a little bit and you feel lighter, more energized, like pay attention to that. Keep a log of like how you intangibly feel on the day to day compared to what you're eating. And it can make a really big difference in not only your fat loss results, but also just how you feel.
Yeah. And then also just to go off on like a little side tangent, I've seen some people who have gluten and dairy intolerances and like sensitivities, and then they'll go to like Italy and they'll eat pizza and
Yeah,
bread and croissants and have no issues.
because the quality. Yeah,
Yeah, which I'm
it's
like,
really
oh my,
common.
yeah. So I'm like, dang, like now I really need to go to Italy. But
Everyone's making
yeah,
sourdough because they don't want to have all the ingredients. Have you done that yet?
I was eating that before we started our podcast.
Nice.
I am a big sourdough girly right now.
Nice.
It's fun. It's fun, but not to, it's a cult, but that's a
Ooh,
whole
big fan of
different,
cult.
yeah, whole different topic. But yeah, so I think those are really good things to consider. And I think we've harped on the food quality. But again, like, are we being as accurate as possible? Because there's a really, really big difference between eyeballing our food. There's a difference between using, measuring spoons like tablespoons, cups, things like that, versus actually using a food scale.
Yeah.
And then the other thing too is, again, like, are we just saying like, oh, like I'm having lasagna, so let me just find a lasagna entry, or am I tracking my ingredients, or you know am I measuring things out, versus like, again, it's like if we have a specific goal and that's fat loss and we really want to see it, maybe we have something coming up, or for, whatever, just going through this temporary phase, it might be easier just to like, hey, let me just do like a chicken, a carb source, and a vegetable, and like leave it at that, because that way I know it's accurate, it's easy to track, I don't have to stress over it, I have to weigh all these ingredients and weigh everything out. um I kind of err for that, like, or not err, but I like doing that when I'm a fat loss phase. I don't like having to do all that and estimate and weigh all the measurements and do, the specific math. Like, just keep it easy. Just keep it simple.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where using those basic meal templates like a lean protein source, vegetable, starchy carbohydrate, and just like keeping your meals really basic like that can be really helpful in fat loss. So just being less like, I like to think of it as, this is a quote, or not a quote, but a phrase that I've used with a couple clients who are kind of in this boat is, what could I do without? Like,
Mhm.
can I just be a minimalist for this short period of time? Not because I need to be that way forever, because that's not a lifestyle. However, if we have a goal that is front of mind, we need to hit that goal, that is a top priority, then things can change temporarily to hit that. And then we can always shift back to kind of our default from there. So Just some things to think about there. Again, not to stress over because that can actually, and we'll go into this part next, but that could actually detract from your progress in a different way. But to just be mindful of, again, if you have all those basics down, this shouldn't feel like an overwhelming amount of change. But if you, and that's a good signal too, right? If you feel like all the things that we just said are like, oh my God, now I'm really stressed out. Well, it might be because your foundations aren't as good as you think they are. And I would revisit that first because for me, I mean, I am a seasoned vet at this, but like I was actually talking to someone the other day and she was kind of walking me through and it was a little bit more about like God, really in-depth like neurotransmitter brain health with her for me. And she was like, "Well, let's cover this first. Low-hanging fruit, like macros, sleep, steps, like how's all that?" And I listed it out and I was like pretty much like 8 to 9 hours of sleep, sometimes 10, hitting my macros, at least 800 grams a day of fibrous fruits and vegetables, hydration, steps, 8 to 10,000. All of that is like autopilot for me. Like I don't have to think about it. It's kind of like 2 seconds of my day and I'm good. And so if it's not somewhere, and it doesn't have to be all that way, but like if it's not somewhere near that level of like automatic, then these extra details are going to be a lot of headspace to take up.
Yeah. And I've used this example time and time again with one of my clients where she, we had adjusted quite a bit over time. And eventually it got to the point where she was checking in. She's like, do I need to do anything else? And I'm like, no. I was like, we just maintain here. I was like, she's like, are you sure? Like, it just feels really easy. And I'm like, yes,
The
this
point.
means, yeah, that's the point. We're in a fantastic place right now. And we just cruise here. And she was like, cool. But she was one of those like, I should be doing more. It's like, no, no, no. This is the goal.
Yes.
But the other thing I wanted to talk about is your history with dieting. And I think that that makes a really, really, really big difference because we have seen this with clients time and time again, where someone has not dieted, and I'm sorry, it's really loud. um, Someone has not dieted ever, and they go into a fat loss phase and they see tons of progress.
Yeah.
And we have another person who enters a fat loss phase. Again, everything on paper looks good, but they're not seeing progress. And we have to look at their history. What has it looked like? Like, did they just spend 3 to 6 months at a maintenance phase for the first time ever? And they've always been a chronic dieter. And it might be like, hey, we actually need to spend a little bit more time like in maintenance and like letting your body recover. And maybe we jumped the fat loss phase a little too early. And it can feel really frustrating because someone who is a chronic dieter typically wants to lose weight. That's what they've been working towards their entire life. And it is really hard, especially when they're comparing themselves to other people who do see easy progress. And it can feel really, really, really frustrating. And I think in moments like that, like again, if we're doing everything right, we're dialing everything in and we're still seeing that weight loss resistance, that might be an indicator that we actually need to take a step back and spend more time in maintenance or spend more time in a surplus, spend more time building muscle. And it is a unfortunate reality for some people. And, we can kind of have the woe is me and we can pity it or just accept like, hey, this is our current reality and it might take us a little bit longer compared to someone else.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, right, just taking it as it is versus like making it a good or bad thing, because at the end of the day, if it is what it is, then, why harp on it being such a negative if you could move through that quicker by not resisting it and just allowing it to be, and then you're actually at your goal a little bit faster in the long run. So, yeah, kind of there's the push and the pull, right? So all the dialing in with the nutrition is definitely like a push forward, like more
Mm-hmm.
mental energy, more time, more thought. But there is a point, like let's say all that's kind of dialed in and you've been working on fat loss for a while, calories are pretty low, and you're just hitting these plateaus and they're hard plateaus and you're really frustrated as to why. Well, a lot of things that can happen when you are dieting and you're trying to get to that next level and your body's fighting it can be a matter of too much versus too little effort and time and sacrifice. And so this is kind of that example that you said when you pulled this person's um, nutrition up and their cardio down and really had them focus on sleep, that's a little bit of that like pulling back, allowing the body to recover, because there does have to be a push and a pull when it comes to achieving, that next level of fat loss. I would say if you're, 100 pounds overweight, this is probably not going to apply for your first 50 at least, right? But if you've been on a journey to lose 30 pounds and you're on the last 10, then yeah, like this is probably where that plays into it. And so, especially for that chronic dieter type 2 who's really, really stressed out all the time and struggles with kind of just staying consistent. That's something I do remember from my bodybuilding times was one of the coaches that I had would really operate in that push and pull. So we'd go really, really hard for like 5 days, and then we'd have a 2 day like pull back, refeed, more food, less cardio. And it worked wonders because if the body doesn't recover, then more inflammation pops up, more stress mentally and physically pops up. Your hormones respond to stress in that way, and your body will resist more than if you just gave it the break that it needed. So you really have to be able to be objective about this, because on one hand you could be feeling like you're putting in a lot of effort but still not dialed in. But on another hand, you might be like, I personally identify on this side of things where I will kind of just keep pushing when what I really need is rest. And so that's where having a coach can be really, really helpful, because we often will not see it the right way. And I know for myself personally, I almost never see it in the light of I need rest, I need recovery.
I was just thinking back to 2020 when I sent my check-in response to my coach. And again, this was prep, so again, different thing. But he responded back that I needed to take like a week-long diet break, and I started crying because I was so upset, and I was wanting him to tell me, let's eat dirt.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is really, really hard when your goal is fat loss to hear, hey, let's pause temporarily, like let's pull back. That can be really tough.
Yeah.
Um, and so I feel like there are a couple other things that I want to cover here, but maybe your body is resisting fat loss because you don't really have much left to lose. So I think that that's really, really important, because it's like maybe you're really trying to lose the last couple pounds. And so we have an episode on this. It's like, do you really need to lose the last 5 pounds? Like, do you really need to push your body to that level? Because for a majority of women, like it is very difficult to get lean. Like a lot of times, people will tell me their goals and they're like, I want visible abs. And I'm thinking, I'm like, the only time I have visible abs is when I am 100% on in prep, like doing, cardio every single day. I'm weighing everything out. Like a lot of people genetically do not have that capability to see abs or have abs like year round. So it's kind of like, do you really need to lose that weight? Do you really want to push to that level of adherence in order to lose a couple more pounds? Because again, we talk about the dial analogy all the time. If you're at an 8 or a 9, do you really want to crank up to a 10? And if you do, and if you have that capacity, like freaking go for it, right? Like if you want to see abs, if you want to push yourself to that level, like go for it. But yeah, it's like I think that sometimes our ideal physique or like our dream body might be a little bit like out of reach for like the normal everyday person, and like they don't recognize the realities of what it would take to get there. But again, if you want to, go for it. If you want to push your body, if you want to see what you're capable of, like go for it. But we want to consider like what is our quality of life? What are the things that we have going on in our life right now? Like if we're got events every single weekend, if we've got like a lot of stress, if we're working really hard and like we don't have the opportunity to turn that dial up, then like might be a place where, hey, let's just maintain right now. Like instead of pushing forward and trying to lose, a couple more pounds.
Well, and I would say too, like that is very valid for that chronic dieter type, because you've just from trying to lose and lose and lose. But it kind of like makes me think of the quote by, who knows, a lot of great coaches out there have said this, but most women who want to lose 10 pounds will be better off putting on 10 pounds of muscle than losing 10 more
Mhm.
pounds on the scale. And so if you're in that position where you're like 5 more pounds, but nothing's really happening because you kind of keep banging your head against the wall, it might be because you just don't actually have the muscular base. Like, and I'll even use myself as an example. I've had an odd amount of ab visibility in the past like 6 months because I actually just spent a lot of time at maintenance, building my core strength, and also like building up the musculature in my abs. And so now they are more visible most of the time. A, because of the type of workouts that I'm doing, like CrossFit is just very core heavy, but also because I didn't keep dieting. Like I just allowed it to be. And so most people who want to have the visibility of your abs, your arms, your shoulders, your whatever, it's not going to come from losing more. It's going to come from building what's underneath. And so for me, that was something where I was like, holy crap, maybe I like, and this was a really weird realization, but I was like, maybe I can like have visible abs and like look jacked or look like I lift. But it wasn't coming from dieting. It was from cutting dieting short and actually building off of that because my body fat percentage basically stayed the same. But the more muscle you have, if you change nothing else, your body fat percentage actually goes down as a result, right? So
Yeah.
just things to think about when you're thinking about dieting, fat loss, and fighting that. And what I will say too is everything that builds into fat loss also is, when it comes to pulling back and resting more, can also aid muscle gain. So an example is if you're waking up and doing cardio every morning, or you're waking up and you're doing 5 a.m. workouts, 5, 6 days a week, and that's in the efforts to burn calories, to lose fat, something that in a pullback phase that you might not have had, that might just be a day or two, it might be a week, it might be a month or months. I'm not sure. It depends on the circumstance. But if that's what your body needs, it might be sleeping in, giving yourself the extra couple of hours of sleep, because that is going to be more beneficial to the process of recovering, losing fat, energy balance, your hormones, than waking up and doing that cardio. Because there is such thing as too much, and too much can cause more inflammation than necessary and can cause more resistance than necessary. We've all probably heard of the whole survival mode thing at this point. But what does that really mean? It just means that you're pushing harder than your body can recover from. And so nothing's actually happening because you're just operating out of a deficit, out of a hole. So, and not the good kind of deficit, like one that is just detrimental to your body's health. So hopefully that
Mm.
makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. And then the other thing that I wanted to touch on was like, where are you mentally? And again, like we've talked about stress and how much that can impact you, but then like what does your day-to-day kind of look like? Like how are you talking to yourself? Like what are your beliefs, what are your thought processes when you're going through something like a fat loss phase? Because again, a lot of women that we talk to, we speak to a lot in the DMs, like they really dislike their body, and it's a really sad reality. But if you wake up every single day wanting to lose 10, 20 pounds, and like we've talked about this in so many different episodes, like are we processed or outcome focused? And so I feel like this kind of does go a little bit back into like foundations, like making sure we're mentally like ready and prepared to go into a fat loss phase.
Yeah.
But for someone who maybe this is their first episode that they've ever listened to, it's like we want to make sure that like you are like your mentality is like, I'm doing this because I love myself and I honor my body and I respect my body, and like I want to do this so I can get healthier. Yeah, I want to look a little bit better. But if you're waking up every single day like being like, I'm not 20 pounds later, like this sucks, like I'm not at my goal, like I hate this, I hate my body, like you go to the gym and you feel like it's punishment, like you feel like eating healthy foods is punishment, like you're going to have a very, very, very different experience than someone who's like, cool, I can't like wait to see what this like process and journey is going to be like, or like, wow, I'm learning so much, or wow, look at how much my body has changed. Like they're like they could be doing like the exact same protocols, but just the way that they're viewing things is very, very different. So you're going to have a very, very different outcome and very different experience with those two different mindsets. So I'd really challenge you to kind of think about, like, what is your why? Why are you doing this? Like, how can you make it a little bit more fun for you? How can you, and we've talked about this before, like, how can you change your body image and how you talk to yourself while you're going through a process like this?
Yeah.
And I think that is really, really, really important because, again, like, if you're stressing, if you're hating everything, like, you're not going to enjoy it, and you're probably not going to want to do it, and you're going to hate every second, and you're not going to see as much progress as someone else who is more positive throughout
Yeah.
the whole thing.
You know who had a really good Instagram reel about that was my head coach, Marilyn. She had
Mm.
it was like contrasting contest prep 1 versus 2. And the first one was like kind of an adventure, like, ooh, this is fun, this is exciting, this is new. And the second one was just like dreading every moment. And it's like, I think in one circumstance, you could really white knuckle through both circumstances and make it through. But I would argue that most people who take that second outlook of negativity and it's a chore, dreading it, they're just not going to adhere as well. Like, regardless of the like woo woo psychological effects that actually has, and it does have on your physiology, your hormones, your actual body's ability to respond because the belief is not there. Outside of that, like, you're just not going to adhere because you hate it. And
Mhm.
you're going to be like, what's the point all the time? And it's very hard to stick with something 100% when you are constantly having these feelings of what's even the point of doing this. So
Yeah.
I would say just from an adherence standpoint alone, it's very important to get your mindset in check and look at this journey, no matter how hard it is like you said, a learning opportunity, and explore it with curiosity. Like, you're really learning about yourself at every step if you look for those things. And it does make it more enjoyable, it makes it easier to stick to. Um, so yeah, I would say that mentality portion is just as big as pulling back or pushing harder or dialing in. And we've got plenty of episodes on that too.
Yes. But yeah, it does really make a big difference because if you hate every single aspect of the process, like, there are a lot of times you're not gonna do it. Like, again, the adherence, it's like, whether it's going on walks, whether it's the meals that you're eating. So you do need to find some ways to do things that you enjoy. So, Eric Helms talked about this a lot, like, in his muscle and strength period, the pyramids. And when it talks about, like, your training and what you're eating, like, we do need to enjoy part of it, right? Like, if we're
Yeah.
eating, tilapia and asparagus 6, 7 times a day, like, there, there's a really big chance you're going to burn out and you're not going to want to eat that anymore. And it's going to kind of suck. So, we're talking about food quality and making these little adjustments, but at the same time, we still want to make sure that we're liking what we're eating, we're liking what we're doing as far as workouts and things like that. And this is not to say you're going to enjoy every single aspect of the journey, or everything is sunshine and rainbows and you're not going to have a bad day. Like, that's not reality.
Yeah.
But for the majority of the time, you should like and you should enjoy and have a more positive outlook, and that's just going to make everything better, your results better, the process better, the journey better, and you're gonna, like, I feel like, be more likely to do it again in the future.
Yeah. Well, I'll say is like, right, finding the path of least resistance for the things that fit the bill. So, like, enjoying the foods that you eat within the constraints of full nutrient dense foods and how you prepare it and all that. But then, like you said, there will be things that you don't enjoy. And I think for those, finding what you do enjoy out of those things. So, like, you might not enjoy feeling physically uncomfortable doing cardio or doing a workout, but you might enjoy the feeling you get after, or you might enjoy the accomplished feeling of like checking the box on your training session or something. So you have to figure out, like, what do I enjoy out of this? Because there's something you can find the joy in the things that you don't like. And then you can build a more positive relationship with them, even if they're never the thing that you just like look forward to and love, right? Because that may not be realistic, but look for that silver lining because it will give you more out of it than if you were to just dread it and hate the whole thing.
Yeah. And that could also just be like habit stacking or like habit pairing. So it's like, okay, I don't I don't like getting steps, but like if I turn my favorite show on and at the
Yeah.
gym and I'm able to watch something, or maybe I call a friend and we get a workout in together and that makes it more enjoyable, or whatever it may be. And then the other thing too, as far as adherence is, and this is getting like nitty gritty, but you talked about pushing for 5 and then you had 2 days of like refeeds. It's like
Yeah.
that can also help a lot with adherence, because it's like, okay, I just need to push for 5, and then on the weekend, like I get some higher carbs and I get to look forward to XYZ. And that can help a little bit too. Whereas if you feel like, again, the white knuckling every single day and not really seeing like an end in sight, that can
Yeah.
be really hard.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, I think how you approach it mentally can make a really big difference. But yeah, so basically we covered the food, the pushing more on the food, pulling back with things like sleep and stress and just how much demand is on your body, and then the mentality around it all. Is there anything else that you wanted to add?
No. So I think that this is a really good transition because let's say we're doing everything right. We're
All that.
pushing, yeah, everything. Sleep, like everything is good, but we are still not seeing fat loss. This is another episode that we will cover. It's like, okay, like there might be some underlying conditions. There might be some things that are going on. Like I always say, kind of like under the hood. So we want to like peel back and kind of get some things done, potentially lab work, and see if there are anything like other things that are going on that we might need to address first before we're going to see some fat loss. So that's actually what we're going to cover in the next episode, is when is the right time to get lab work done or some other things done. So
Yeah.
um, hopefully you guys enjoyed this episode. If you haven't already, make sure you're subscribed to the podcast. You can find both of us on Instagram. You can find me at Christy Lynn Fit. Marissa is at Marissa Roy Fitness. Thank you guys so much for listening, and we hope to see you back next week.